For privacy reasons, the names of individuals involved in this case have been changed. Stay tuned. Rochester, New York, early 1970s. A series of grisly disappearances and murders has gripped the city. 3 innocent girls have vanished without a trace. When their bodies are found, a horrifying truth emerges. The victims' names, their surnames, and the location where they were found all begin with the same letter. Is this just a terrifying coincidence? Or the twisted plan of a killer obsessed with a deadly game? While the police struggled to find clues, the public was constantly bewildered by the invisible shadow lurking somewhere in the community. Hundreds of people were questioned. Theories were built and then erased. But the answer remained in the dark. Who committed these gruesome crimes? And is it possible that the perpetrator is still present, observing, anticipating, and preparing for another series of tragedies? Where every unsolved mystery contains secrets that want to be revealed, step into the darkness and explore them with us. Don't hesitate to leave a like as an encouragement for us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to update the most classic cases. The Alphabet Murders are one of the most mysterious and haunting series of murders in American crime history. The murders occurred in the Rochester, New York area between 1971 and 1973. The 3 victims, all girls between the ages of 10 and 11, were brutally murdered after mysteriously disappearing. The most terrifying and puzzling thing was the uncanny coincidence between the victims' names, their last names, and the locations where their bodies were found, all beginning with the same letter. Clara Collins, Wendy Wood, and Marie Mason were all murdered under similar circumstances, sexually abused, strangled, and dumped in remote locations. Each girl was found in a location that matched her first or last name, as if the killer had deliberately followed a strange pattern. Police quickly recognized the chilling similarities between the cases and dubbed the series the Alphabet Murders. Despite a years-long investigation involving multiple agencies from local police to the FBI, the real killer was never caught. Several suspects were questioned, including notorious serial killers who lived in the Rochester area during that time. However, no concrete evidence was found to connect anyone to the murders. What made the case particularly difficult to solve was not only the strange pattern of the crimes, but also the lack of hard evidence. Although investigators used every technology available at the time, including DNA testing, all efforts came to a dead end. The specter of a mysterious serial killer still haunts the city of Rochester, while the victims' families continue to live in pain and despair. The Alphabet Murders are not only a serial murder case, but also an unsolved puzzle, a cruel game that the perpetrator seems to have created on purpose. Is it just a suspicious coincidence, or is there a sick plan at work? More than half a century has passed, but the shadow of this case has not completely disappeared. Clara Collins, an innocent and lovely 10-year-old girl, mysteriously disappeared on November 16, 1971, leaving behind a terrifying scene in the Rochester, New York community. That day, like any other normal day, Clara was asked by her grandmother to pick up a prescription from a familiar pharmacy in a peaceful residential area. This was not the first time she had performed this simple task. Clara was a good child, loved by everyone for her cheerful and easygoing personality. But no one expected that this would be the last time people saw Clara alive. According to the last witnesses who saw her, Clara left the pharmacy alone around the afternoon with a frightened expression and an unsteady gait. Some said that she seemed to have just experienced something terrible, because Clara's eyes were filled with fear, and she walked hurriedly, seemingly wanting to run away from someone or something. These descriptions became even more haunting when several drivers driving along Interstate 490 that day saw Clara running in a panic along the wide, crowded road. She was said to have tried to wave for help from drivers as she ran down the highway, but no one stopped. Some thought she was just a child playing, or perhaps being scolded and running away from home. No one could have imagined that she was trying to escape a stalker. a villain with cruel intentions. What had seemed like an innocent trip to the pharmacy turned into a terrifying nightmare. The search for Clara began that same day when she failed to return home as usual. Her family, extremely worried, called the police. Authorities were quickly mobilized, expanding the search area around the Rochester area. Local volunteers joined in, combing the streets, parks, and suburbs, hoping to find Clara safe. However, all they found was growing fear. As time passed without any trace of her, 2 days later, on November 18, 1971, Clara Collins's body was found in a remote area off Highway 490, near Churchville, New York, about 12 miles from her home. The location of the body, in a remote, sparsely populated area, added to the mystery and horror of the case. Someone had taken her far away from the residential area to a place where the killer thought she would never be found. An autopsy soon after revealed that Clara had been brutally sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. The injuries on the girl's body, along with the signs of struggle found at the scene, showed that Clara had tried to fight off her attacker with all her might. That struggle, though desperate, was also a testament to her courage in her final, haunting moments. What particularly caught the investigators' attention was the strange detail related to the victim's name. Clara Collins, a name that begins with 2C, and the location where her body was found was Churchville, a town that begins with the letter C. This coincidence made the police wonder if the killer was deliberately setting up a certain morbid pattern. These details could not be ignored. The police began to theorize that the killer might be following a certain pattern when choosing victims and locations. Was it a coincidence or a disturbing sign of how the killer planned his murder? Although investigators tried to collect evidence from the scene, the results were too little. There were no direct witnesses to the attacker. There was no clear DNA or any physical evidence that could lead the police closer to the killer. All they had were vague accounts from a few drivers who saw Clara in a panic, running down the freeway as if trying to escape something terrible. The Clara Collins case became a nightmare for Rochester, not only because of its brutality, but also because of the hopelessness of the investigation. Every trace led to a dead end, and the scariest thing was that the killer seemed to be at large, somewhere in the community. People began to fear for the safety of their children, not knowing that this was just the beginning of a series of horrifying murders known as the Alphabet Murders. More than a year after Clara Lopez was murdered, the cold case was suddenly revived by another horrific event. On April 2, 1973, Wendy Wood, a lively and cheerful 11-year-old girl, was reported missing after leaving a familiar grocery store in Rochester, New York. That afternoon, Wendy had been asked by her mother to pick up some groceries for dinner. It was not the first time she had undertaken this task, as Wendy was an independent child who had often walked to the local store without any problems. According to the last witnesses to see Wendy, she left the store in a completely normal state, carrying a heavy bag of groceries in both hands and attempting to walk home along the familiar route. Several neighbors remembered seeing Wendy walking by, sometimes stopping to say hello or smiling back at them. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as the sun set and Wendy still hadn't returned home, concern quickly turned to panic. Wendy's parents called every friend of hers, asking around for any clues. All they got in return were confused shakes of the head. No one had seen her after leaving the store. Late in the evening, Wendy was reported missing to the police. A massive search was launched, involving local police, volunteers, and residents. Every street, alley, park, and deserted area around Rochester was scoured. Volunteers roamed the streets, flashlights in hand, calling out the girl's name in desperation. Police interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, but all leads were vague, and no clear leads emerged. As they searched, they were burdened by the painful memory of the unsolved Clara Collins case. The next day, April 3, 1973, Wendy Wood body was found lying on the side of the road in Webster, New York, a small town about 10 miles from her home. The body was discovered by a truck driver traveling along a deserted road. Police were immediately on the scene, sealing off the area to collect evidence. But once again, the crime scene was empty and lacked any obvious signs of a perpetrator. An autopsy later revealed that Wendy had suffered a sexual assault before being strangled to death, similar to what had happened to Clara Collins. Her body bore bruises that showed that she had struggled fiercely before being completely subdued. The murder was considered extremely brutal, and the similarities in the manner of the crime were too much for the police to ignore. Once again, investigators began to notice suspicious coincidences involving the victims' names. Wendy Wood, a name that began with 2W, was similar to how Clara Collins' name also began with 2C. And the location where Wendy's body was found was Webster, a place that begins with a W, similar to how Clara's body was discovered in Churchville. These similarities not only shocked the police, but also raised fears in the Rochester community. Was the killer choosing his victims according to some strange pattern? Or was he deliberately leaving signs to challenge the authorities? These questions kept investigators thinking. The media began to cover the case extensively, not only because of its brutality, but also because of the mysterious connections between the victims. The Rochester police chief held an emergency press conference, pledging to do everything possible to bring the killer to justice. However, despite all the investigative efforts, the police were still unable to find any concrete evidence that could lead them closer to the killer. The case of Wendy Wood, like Clara Collins before it, became a dark mystery without answers. 2 innocent girls were brutally murdered, and all that remained were faint traces and fear that enveloped the entire city of Rochester. Parents in the area began to be on high alert, forbidding their children from going out alone. No one dared to let their children leave the house without close supervision. But the scariest thing was that everyone knew that the killer was still at large, lurking somewhere in the dark. And if he really is following some sick rule, then it might only be a matter of time before he strikes again. The third case occurred on a cold winter day when the Rochester air was filled with icy winds. On November 26, 1973, Marie Mason, a gentle and hardworking 11-year-old girl, disappeared on her way home from school. Marie was a good student, well liked by her teachers and classmates. She usually walked home after school, but sometimes asked for a ride if she met someone she knew or if the weather was too harsh. Marie left school that day in the late afternoon, when it was getting dark faster than usual due to the short winter days. Classmates said she seemed to be in a hurry because her mother had told her to come home early to help with the housework. Marie often walked a short distance to a nearby shopping center before continuing home. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Marie standing on the sidewalk near the shopping center, seemingly waiting or trying to hitchhike. This was not uncommon for Marie, as she had been given rides home by neighbors or family friends before. However, this time, the witness accounts caught the attention of the police. According to the testimony of a woman driving by, she saw Marie standing next to a parked car, and then saw her open the door and get in. The car was described as a light-colored sedan, but because it was dark and the streetlights were dim, the witness could not clearly determine the exact color or identify the driver. 2 days passed in extreme anxiety for Marie's family. They called the police the night Marie did not return, and urgent searches were conducted throughout the night and the next day. But all efforts were in vain. Marie's photos were distributed everywhere, on lampposts, school bulletin boards, and even on local radio programs. Finally, on November 28, 1973, Marie's body was discovered in a remote area near Macedon, New York, about 15 miles from where she had disappeared. The finder was a hunter who was checking his traps in a wooded area. As he crossed a small stream, his eyes caught something out of place, a white child's shoe lying among the dead leaves. The police were called to the scene immediately, and once again they were confronted with the same brutal scene they had witnessed before. An autopsy confirmed that Marie had been sexually assaulted and strangled in exactly the same way as Clara and Wendy. The bruises on her body showed that Marie had tried to resist, but the strength of a child was no match for her attacker. What particularly caught investigators' attention was not only the repetitive nature of the murders, but also the terrifying coincidence in the way the victims were selected. Marie Mason, a name that began with the letter M, and the body of the girl found in Macedon also began with the letter M. Police began to be haunted by the idea that the killer might be following some sort of sick pattern, selecting victims by their last name and the location of their bodies in alphabetical order. 3 cases, 3 innocent girls, all murdered in similar fashion, and all with strange markings related to their names. Local media immediately reported on the coincidence, causing panic and suspicion among the public. Parents in Rochester began to forbid their children from going out alone, even during the day. Schools issued emergency warnings and encouraged students to travel in groups or with an adult. Rochester police, under pressure from the public and the authorities, deploy a special investigation team with the sole mission of finding the killer. The files of the 3 cases are turned over, and every little detail is carefully analyzed. But the most terrifying thing is that the killer is still at large. He has left no specific traces that could help identify him, and his motive seems to be satisfaction from his brutal crimes. 3 names: Clara, Wendy, Marie. The first 3 letters are C, W, and M. Is this a coincidence? Or is it a deliberate pattern? When every clue seems to lead to a dead end, this question becomes the obsession of the entire city of Rochester. And the worst thing is that everyone knows that the killer will probably strike again. Investigators quickly noticed a clear pattern in the killer after a series of gruesome murders occurred in Rochester, New York, between 1971 and 1973. All 3 victims were girls between the ages of 10 and 11 who had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The victims' bodies were found in locations whose names began with the same initial as their names, creating an unusual and haunting pattern. The victims included a girl named Clara, who was found in Churchville, a girl named Wendy, who was found in Webster, and a girl named Marie, who was murdered and found in Macedon. The fact that the locations where the bodies were found all had the same initial as the victims' names led investigators to believe that this could not be a coincidence. Local media quickly dubbed the series of cases the Alphabet Murders. Major Rochester newspapers ran stories about the grisly killings. Television broadcasts also aired special news bulletins, urging citizens to be vigilant and cooperate with police. The case quickly attracted public attention, creating horror and deep anxiety in the community. Parents began to fear for the safety of their children. Children were forbidden to leave the house alone, and discussions of the case became a daily topic in the news and newspapers. Under pressure from public opinion, local authorities had to mobilize all necessary resources to find the perpetrator. The investigation quickly expanded, attracting the participation of the FBI, Rochester Police, and New York State Police. A task force was formed with the most experienced investigators. They interviewed hundreds of people in the area, collecting statements from people who may have seen or heard something suspicious at the time of the cases. They also reviewed criminal records from other areas in search of cases with similar motifs. One of the most prominent suspects brought into the investigation was Michael Black, one of 2 notorious serial killers known as the Hillside Stranglers. Black had lived in Rochester during the time of the murders, leading investigators to believe he might be involved. However, despite interviews and physical evidence testing, there was no direct evidence linking Black to the Alphabet Murders. In addition, David Nasso, another serial killer arrested in 2010, was also targeted due to suspicious similarities. Nasso was known for killing several women in California, and one notable detail was that his victims all had names that began with the same letter as their last names. Additionally, Nasso had lived in Rochester during the 1970s, which coincided with the time of the murders. However, investigators found no concrete evidence linking him to the Rochester murders, despite conducting the most advanced forensic tests. In addition to the notorious serial killers, investigators also expanded their investigation to individuals who had direct or indirect contact with the victims. Eric Lopez, a relative of Clara Lopez, one of the victims, was brought into the spotlight due to his suspicious behavior and unusual demeanor during interviews. However, despite being questioned several times and investigators carefully examining all relevant evidence, nothing could be found to link him to the case. Throughout the investigation, the authorities faced many difficulties and obstacles. Despite conducting hundreds of interviews, examining every single detail from the crime scene, analyzing DNA samples and comparing fingerprints, all efforts led to dead ends. Even criminal psychologists were called in to try to create a profile of the killer, but none of the sketches helped narrow down the list of suspects. Over time, The Alphabet Murders became one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history. Although investigators spent years researching and trying to find the killer, all the clues were either weak or insufficient to bring charges. The Rochester community still lives in lingering fear, and the case has become a deep scar in the memories of the people here. Occasionally, some independent investigators or journalists continue to study the case, hoping that advances in forensic science or new testimony will bring light to a case that has been covered in dust for years. But to this day, the killer has yet to be caught, and the mysteries surrounding the Alphabet Murders remain, haunting any efforts to find justice. Is the killer a faceless figure, still living at large somewhere, unsuspected or undiscovered? Or is this case actually connected to a series of other crimes that have so far remained unconnected? As forensic technology continues to advance and new investigative methods are employed, will the truth eventually come to light? Or will the mysteries surrounding the Alphabet Murders remain forever buried in the dark, leaving only unanswered questions and haunting memories? Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this story and want to dive deeper into more intriguing mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.